So I would now like to begin by acknowledging the lands that we are on. Today, in this virtual world, many of us are spread out in many places around the globe. So considering this, I would like to invite everyone to reflect personally on the land where you find yourself, how you've come to be there, and how you relate to that place today. Personally, I am speaking to you today from Toronto on the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Huron-Wendat, and the Seneca. Today, Toronto has a treaty with the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation and sits on the territory of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations to share the land equitably. I personally feel incredibly grateful to have grown up on this beautiful land and to call this place my home. However, it is also essential to acknowledge that these lands and those Indigenous to these lands have been subjected to the ideological, physical, emotional, and spiritual violence of both colonizers and settlers. This violence is ongoing. Despite this, Indigenous communities across Turtle Island and around the world have resisted and continue to resist these harmful colonial structures, and they continue to stand at the front lines of cultural, epistemic, and environmental protection and social justice. So today, as a non-Indigenous settler to this land, I wish to both express my gratitude and acknowledge my responsibility to resist and deconstruct harmful narratives of ongoing colonialism each and every day, and to work instead towards responsible and reciprocal relationships on this land. In this spirit, I am very pleased to present our speaker for today, Professor George Day. Professor Day is a renowned educator, researcher, and writer, and he is one of Canada's foremost scholars on race and anti-racism studies. He has won many awards for his work, most recently in 2021, the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Ontario Alliance of Black School Educators for his extensive work promoting Black and minority youth education. Here at OISE, University of Toronto, George Day is a professor of social justice education and the director of the Center for Integrative Anti-Racism Studies. Additionally, in 2007, Professor Day was installed as a traditional chief in Ghana, specifically as the Jasuhene of the town of Asokore Koforidwa in the New Dwabin traditional area of Ghana. His stool name is Nana Aduse Sefa Tweneboa. Nana, it is a true honor to have you here today to hear about your work on African elders and eldership. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you all for coming. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Luis. I'm going to share screen, so let me see. So, okay. We've already done the land acknowledgement, but I also want to dedicate this in memory of colleagues who passed away in the past. And I start with Charles Mills. Charles Mills, someone who, during my graduate days at the University of Toronto in the 1980s, asked me to think seriously about the colonial history of my discipline, anthropology. That has stuck with me with true time. And then Leonard Wandili, one of those students who always had your back. And sometimes you wonder why they had to leave so soon. And of course, Lee Marker, for her teachings, in terms of telling those of us who've come to this land, not just go away, but actually there's a gift, and that is the gift of the knowledge, and that we should work with the teachings of the land. That is so important to engage it in what we do, whether as scholars, whether as learners, or whether as community workers. And lastly, Darren Lund, who in 1998 had a very harsh critique of my work on anti-racism, social justice, and Afrocentricity. But in later years, he had the character to publicly admit that his critique of my work was misguided, and that he had come to see the things that I was seeing as very, very relevant in his own work and journey on issues of race, social justice, LGBT communities, and of course, the whole question of coloniality. They are with the ancestors now, so I ask permission for the ancestors to bring them along as they enter this room. I also come to you as a member of the SSHRC clan, the clan of Ghana. And for me, the vulture is our animal spirit. And what the vulture, you know, the vulture scavenges on the rubbish dump. And it's a teaching that our parents teach us that to make good use of whatever is discarded. So there's nothing that is useless. And you see the vulture scavenging on the garbage dump to find something useful to survive. But I also want to acknowledge all the knowledge holders and co-creators, the many, many Black African elders I've come into contact with, the community educators, the community workers, the parents, the students, and the origin researchers. And I just want to mention, I mean, there's so many names, but I think to me, when we talk of the community, folks like George Frimpong and Sylvia Paris of DBLB in Halifax, Fiona Henry, Mary Green, Audrey Little-John, Caris Newton, Maria Gallic, Kirkmack, for all the work they did to introduce me to elders and community workers to talk to. And then for the students, so many of you, some of whom are in the room, but I'm talking of the Sules, I'm talking of the Jennifers, I'm talking of the Ernest, I'm talking of the Grace Gallo, the Grace Edgar, the Huda, the Ilya, the Wambui, the Mary Carmen, the Harriet Akamori, and many, many, many others. You know yourself for always having my back. So at this stage, we are over a circle, we are under the tree. Be part of a learning journey. I start with the intellectual and political project here. And you know, my academic travel, I call my academic travel as more like a transcendence, working with African cultural knowings beyond the continent, I mean, coming from the continent, traversing across space to Turtle Island and the diaspora, with a particular intellectual and liberty project, which is to map out the pathway, as Amy Cesare talks about, to find my center. This work, return to my native land. I think in this academic travelogue, I've always talked about being a distinctive Black African voice. That spirit of what I've called academic warriorship goes from people like Ronnie when they talk about the gorilla intellectual. But I also have, as an African scholar, to think through what I call an epistemic challenge. And this is posed more by the South Asian scholar, Abachi. And it's to paraphrase. in his piece on Can Non-Europeans Think, which is an oxymoron. It's laughable, if not for the seriousness of it. When he writes, quote, "We are all entitled to a degree of self-centrism. However, the question is not whether non-dominant thinking or bodies of knowledge, quote, can reach a self-consciousness and evident neutrality, unquote, but rather for us to engage such knowledge as intellectual and anti-colonial resistance and subversion with a main goal of, quote, offering alternative, counter, complementary, contradictory, or even different visions of reality more rooted in the lived experiences, in my case, of African peoples." So there are certain questions that guide me in coming to a talk on African elders and eldership. And this is from one of my former students, Temitope Adefarakan. When she basically posed, and this paraphrase, when it says, "What new paths can we carve from knowledge from multiple, converging, diverse, and contending experiences of indigenous peoples globally in resisting colonialism, imperialism, and Euro-modernity?" It's a paraphrase. And then way back in 2011, I was asking the question, how do we theorize indigeneity through and beyond dialectical histories of materialism? And I was focused on questions of transnational mobility, place, and belonging as we pursue this subversive intellectual process that helps us to demystify and demythologize whiteness in our schools. But in particular, how do we engage elders, case-based epistemologies and ontologies? How do we engage this? The way they inform us about questions of group, community, environments, and the way we read nature as human to create epistemic resistance and anti-colonial liberatory praxis. In more practical and concrete ways, how do we take up African elders' cultural knowledges as pedagogical practice for true human liberation? That's in terms of the questions. How do we work with the humanities, as well as the paremiology of eldership and elders' resilience to develop what can be called an elder crit, which is creative ways to engage culture and conceptions of humanhood as decolonial and anti-colonial pedagogies? So mapping the terrain, what I want to share with you, I just want to talk a bit about where I'm coming from, and then just briefly on the literature on elders' knowledge, schools, and education, and then my current ongoing research, and then move into some form of theorization, just to engage the hermeneutics of African elders and eldership, elders' cultural knowledges as pedagogical teachings, the gendered readings of eldership, and the question of Black African indigeneity. Then I'll move into some broader philosophical highlights and conclude with looking at the specific objective or the feasibility of bringing elders, African elders, into Canadian schooling. What are the implications and the possibilities for a thinking through? And this thinking through is new Black African educational futurity. So where coming from? I think for me, I'm like many of us in the room here, I think the coloniality of science, its knowledge exclusions, the binary, that colonial binary between science and indigenous. So something is science, something is indigenous. And then modernity and primitivity, those colonial binaries. I'm also coming at it in terms of how our ontologies epistemologies of Black, African, Indigenous, and colonized peoples have been devalued and negated, thereby universalizing the white Western liberal subject as an archetype of humanity, and others have made this point. And in this particular case, we were subtle how through time, working with some of the ideas of Walter Mignolo, when she talks about that modernity coloniality tandem. And all what it has done is to quote, negate, disavow, distort, deny knowledges, subjectivities, world senses, and life visions, unquote, of African and Indigenous peoples. But I also want to work with the rich genealogies of African thought and Black theorizing, and to challenge the colonial appellation of Indigenous. And when I talk about the colonial appellation of the Indigenous, I'm talking about what sometimes seems like a resistance, a hostility, and a denial of African indigeneity. I'm also interested in breaking colonial dichotomies, the nature-culture split, the spiritual-material split, the human-non-human split, as Androtti and many others write about. So to move to some of the literature on elders' knowledge in terms of schooling. I think we look at some of the studies that explore the central place of the experiential and cultural knowledge of Indigenous elders, the land and earthly teachings for educational subversion, what can be called genuine, not fake, genuine decolonization, not false flag decolonization. And this was some of the we have a recent book coming out, myself, Wambui and Chris Edgar, on this, but the others who've been speaking about this in the African context for quite a bit. And not just African context, so I think we have to look at it in territorial analysis. Some of my own colleagues, like Leonard Simpson, Chuck, Nina Smith, and Young. The second dimension of this literature is also how Canadian educational institutions have sought to, and in many ways can incorporate teachings of territorial island Indigenous elders beyond a saviordom to save. So Mary Baptiste, Gondry and Lawrence, and many others again write on this. On this second strand of literature, the question for me has always been, given our academies are what Chisholm talks about, our academies, particularly Western academies, they are laboratories of Western modernity. What are the possibilities of these current initiatives incorporating Indigenous knowledges? And whether this can lead to actual anti-colonial learning spaces. And the last stream of the literature is where it's more like a call to interrogate African Indigenous knowledges in the design of new African and diasporic educational futures. And here, the main point here is that even in this search for new educational futures, what are the possibilities when we are self-operating within the academy, whether it's on the continent or even in the diasporic context? Because as far as the continent is concerned, as Wally Fiasanti and I have argued, right, our academies are colonial satellites of the Western Academy. This is why we would argue that, for example, we do not have African universities. We don't have African universities. Rather, what we have are universities in Africa. One of the Ghanaian philosopher, Kusipra, asked, for example, the question, if a university in Ghana, a university in Kenya, a university in South Africa has a center for African studies, an institute for African studies, it makes you wonder, what are the other departments doing? Shouldn't African studies be central to what everybody does within these African institutions? So this is why some of us will include that we do have universities in Africa, but they are not African universities. So the current academic research that engages me in some of these conversations, this is about a SSHRC Insight Grant project. In later years, I had to partner with the Delmore Badudale Learning Institute in Halifax, Nova Scotia, when I was awarded the Duval DBLD Extraordinary Fellow in Afrocentric Research, particularly in the phase 3, where I had to do some research in Halifax. But there are basically 4 study objectives: to understand how African elders could serve as cultural knowledge custodians in Canadian schooling to address and respond to some of the challenges of Black and minority education. Secondly, to identify elders' teachings that relate to community, social responsibility, land, environment, social justice, equity, leadership, respect, and interdependence, and how this can influence educational and social successes for youth and help develop counter-visions of schooling. Thirdly, to identify the roles of and the challenges faced by community elders in the teaching of local cultural resource knowledges. And lastly, to determine through a comparative and analysis of case studies if there are some promising approaches to anti-colonial education in pluralistic contexts that engage elders' teachings and elders' knowledge. It has been primarily a qualitative study. The phase 1 and 2 was based on literature review, and there were full interviews that were conducted in Africa, working with African elders, teachers, parents, students, also undertaking school classroom observations in Ghana and South Africa. And we did have some initial preliminary transcriptions. The phase 3 was focused on interviews with African and Black elders, educators, school administrators, community workers, parents, and students in Halifax. And then later in Toronto, the Toronto phase was mostly online interviews. And this is where folks like Mary Green, Paris Newton, Maria Gallic, Fiona were very helpful in getting me bodies to have conversations with. And then the current ongoing 2021 beyond, so I've been having some conversations with Mary Green, basically about getting more Canadian youth to interview them, but also to, with COVID permitting, to do some classroom observations. But in the meantime, we are engaged in research write-up, where I've been working with people like Grace Gallo, Ilya, Huda, Enes, Bambui, and Grace Edger, and of course, Sule. The eventual goal is to pilot some of our findings with an Ontario school board, and I've had some discussions with Fiona Henry about this. In all, there has been a total sample of 140 interviews that have been conducted. Out of these, 29 have been elders, and then have been 15 community workers, and then 29 educators. One thing about the community workers and educators is that they are, in fact, in some cases, seen as elders, although they themselves do not see themselves that way. But when you talk to people, people see them as elders. So when you look at it, actually, the sample of elders is more than 29. But they also include university professors and college teachers. And then 39 university, secondary, and elementary schools students, elementary, high school, mostly in Ghana, South Africa. And then we have conducted an additional 22 focus group discussions. The focus have been how elders themselves share their views on eldership. And then how educators, parents, community workers, and students share their understandings of the role and importance of elders and elders' cultural teachings. So theorizing a bit of some of the research findings. So I start with some of the voices. I think we need to hear some of the voices on the conceptualizing elders and eldership. So a high school student in Ghana says, sometimes you can say they are visionaries. An elder is somebody who is a visionary. Another high school student in Ghana says, there are statesmen, people. In these contemporary times, the elders can teach the youth a lot because there's so much moral decadence in society. And then a community elder in Halifax would say, in most cases, an elder could also be a role model for younger generations. An elder in the African sense is also a community member who contributes toward the development of the community. And he's not there just only for his or her own family members, but he's also there for the entire community. And a community educator and worker who actually was seen by others as an elder, actually. See, what do I view as an elder? She was talking about anyone who has been through what I would say experiences that changed them and made them a better person than that they once were. I used to think, I see the word quote elder, I used to think, oh, there has to be an old person, but that's not really the case. For me, an elder would be anyone who has a lot of wisdom. An elder would be someone that has been through certain circumstances in their life, in certain situations, and they can come back and better that person or become a better someone else. So I think people, I have some cousins, I would classify as an elder. They are probably younger than me. I would classify my grandmother, even though she's in her 70s. I classify her as an elder because she has so much wisdom in a seniors group. I'm an old soul, so when I get around older people, I just adapt to them. And I love to hear stories of how they persevered and came through their times of growing up, and how they have come to make and what they have had and stuff like that, right? So I love to sit around and gain knowledge from the elders of my community. Another community elder in Halifax says, in most cases, an elder could be somebody who is seen as a role model for the younger generation. An elder in the African sense is a community member who contributes to the development of the community, and it's not there just only for his own or family members. I think of people who have paved the way. They have left, quote, legacy behind. People's shoulders we have stood on and we're standing on. And also people with a lot of knowledge, wisdom, and so always ready to impart knowledge to younger folks. And it is not to think of elders as people who are finished, they are not done, or ready to go sit in a rocking chair. But elders who have gone through many experiences and are really, some of us are quite happy to impart some of this knowledge. Those who are younger than us are willing to listen. And it's a community elder in Toronto speaking. Then on the whole question of cultivating the culture of eldership, another community elder and educator in Toronto says, sometimes new within our community about leadership that shows eldership and that responsibility. We elders, older people, we need to make sure that within our communities, that we are building very strong communities, that we have that space where individuals feel that, I may have made a bad decision, but I actually have a support that I can go to. So at the grassroots level for elders in the community to actually let younger people know that I'm here, So whatever form that takes in your community, and like I said, I think getting politically involved is very, very important. Another elder from Halifax, a community educator says, well, sometimes elder is equated with leadership, right? And leadership doesn't have an age. It is very difficult to see somebody 20 and call them an elder. But somebody 35 and older, yes, you could. Rather than think of elders as 65 and older, right? Yeah, so for me, even though I said that I will have a difficult time finding somebody 20 to call them an elder, And like I said, 35 and over, with an involvement in the community showing some leadership. You could consider that person an elder. So what do you make of some of these things? I mean, in terms of when we talk about the whole conceptualization of elder and eldership. We see elder as a very generative term. It's defined variedly and contextually. There's a spiritual naming which is anchored in specific geographic and cultural locations. Elder and eldership as referring to a body, but it's also about an identity, and it lists particular practices with responsibilities and expectations. The term elder is bestowed, venerated status is bestowed. It's earned, and it's not merely ascribed by age as elderly. It's an identity which is acknowledged as a step closer to the ancestors, symbolizing the transcendental sanctity of an elder's life. Elder evokes a reciprocal naming, a social position which is accorded with respect for the deep instructive spiritual teachings of eldership. So these teachings are about land, life, ecology, history, culture, and community. Also, you can see an elder as an embodiment of wisdom. The culture holders, the custodians, the community educators, the socializing agents, the healers, the mentors, the possessors of experiential knowledge for a long engagement with social, physical, and metaphysical worlds. The idea of elders as instructors. They instruct in the African sense the 4 life stages: child, adolescence, adult, and elder. And one of the things the teachings uphold is that one cannot skip these stages without encountering life consequences and challenges. You don't skip from child to an adult. You have to go from child to an adolescent, to an adult, and then to an elder. The second aspect of the voices is on elders' cultural knowledges at pedagogical teachings. And so here we see someone talk about, and this is a high school student, elders can teach the youth how to respect good values, moral values, to be an upright individual in society. Another says they will teach you, they'll be telling you Anansi stories. With that Anansi stories, you get something out of it. You get something from that story. Elders are like people I see who have accumulated a lot of experience in our communities, and they can pass this information on to younger ones. They shape our behaviors. Elders can guide us to follow the right path, to move away from the wrong path. I think they really play a lot of our role in our societies. And there are so many things that we can learn from them. This from a professor in South Africa. On the importance of elders in schooling and education, and I said in the African Nova Scotian communities, a lot of stuff is normally hidden. So there's a lot of stuff in our school system that's sent from home. And it's, if they don't ask, they don't tell, that type of mentality. So if you have more elders in our school system, then our kids can confide in and open with us. I think they will bring up literacy more, because a lot of our schools, African Scotian students are suffering. I see that happening in my community. A lot of the kids are suffering because the teachers there who are coming in, they are new teachers, they are fresh, so they don't have that experience as someone in our community world. Here speaks to the authenticity of elders' words, the stories that were mentioned, and the rest as the genuine narratives of the land, culture, history, and ecology. But my former student, Lorraine Holmes, talks about the ancestry of experience. Their roles are very, very indisputable as community and family counselors. They're also social and spiritual healers, conflict resolution through arbitration. They embody family, lineage, and clan membership, social values, and their teachings are about life survival skills. Their pedagogies offer a revival of intergenerational connections and identities, which have long been discounted or silenced by legacies of colonialism, capitalism, cosmopolitanism, and neoliberalism. And elders' knowledge can also be seen as experiential. They are connected to forms of folkloric productions, methodologies of oral storytelling, learning circles, traditional ceremonies, mediation, reconciliation, and many others also. So to bring some gendered readings as well, and this is a Ghanaian educator who speaks about in the Akan culture, we have what we call the abriwatia. The abriwatia is a metaphor to represent an older lady who we consider as an embodiment of wisdom. Another elder says, yes, the women too, we choose them and we give them names like Megajia, being like a champion of the woman. And no matter whoever she is, she's given that title when she has, and she has to be regarded. Yeah, you see, I know there are some communities that women are heads or taking leadership positions, and they're able to perform a role in people, and they really command respect. Yes, this is what I'm saying, that there's always exception to the rules. As we have seen, even in the political system, are women gradually coming up definitely to transcend our cultural circuits? Yes, because some people are becoming more, quote, enlightened, and are beginning to realize that it is not only men who have the ideas, women too have something to share with the society. This is a teacher. And if you look at the Black families, this is a community elder in Nova Scotia speaking, within the African Nova Scotians, and I will even say within the African Canadian families and beyond, the women are the stronghold of the family. The woman is the center of the family, like the grandmas and the staff, and they are the rock of the family. I guess you could say that. I guess you could say that the women hold more presence as elders. They, female elders, know more about the culture, the background, and the community. In the women's sense, it's like they are the nurturers of the community because they have to take care of the children and the women and so forth. I remember the elder women, like the queen mothers, their duty is to help make sure that the women and the children were taken care of. And sometimes even in the council, they always consult the elder women because they make their final, before they make their final decision. You see, unfortunately, we live in a patriarchal society. It's unfortunate. And we pay lip service to gender dynamics. And these women are so important because they raise these kids and they understand them better than us. We see them as grown-ups. We don't understand what made them. They are sustained aspects of growth that we miss. 1 + 1 cannot be 11. That's, it talks about, that's how men would think. The women and mothers and grannies understand that there are certain reasons why this child behaves like these ways. Yeah. So it would be better to have them more involved as elders. And there's a retired professor who is an elder in South Africa. And this is an interview I did with an elder couple in South Africa where we talked about, ever since 1976, after our marriage, she never go and work anywhere. She just was at home raising the kids. And then because once she was at the maiden place, she was more of a cattle or a sheep head. That's what the parents said. The parents were saying a baby girl must not go to school because if you go to school, you are going to learn and then other families will benefit out of your knowledge and our investments as well as education. So you better not go to school. And she's feeling pains and aches. Now that pains her a lot because they have deprived her of the knowledge. And she was just home ever since then, ever since marriage. This is another couple and of blessed memory because since the interview, they passed away. They passed away 2 years ago. So some analysis said, I think the important positions of female elders in the community and embodiment of wisdom, family, virtues, roles, and holding families together. Also, it offers a video which is very, very complex and complicated conceptions of gender and gendered power relations in African communities. There are relations of gender which can be connected to questions of land and ecology, shared roles and responsibilities of genders, which cannot be read simply or strictly in asymmetrical power relations. We also see the tensions of our ancestral cultural traditions when they are juxtaposed through that imposition of Western, sometimes sex-dimorphic conceptions of gender and gender relations. The narratives on the whole reveal complex and changing dynamics of gender in society. And on the question of indigeneity, I think the elders are the ones that can tell us what indigenous knowledge is. So I think we can succeed in writing about indigenous knowledge I don't think we can succeed without involving elders, because they tell us things they have experienced, not what somebody has told them, what they have themselves experienced. The whole concept of eldership can be rooted in indigenous account epistemology, and the essence of that knowledge resides in the community. Elders are custodians of our lands, our value systems, and our history. Analysis here is elders and African eldership offers us a way to re-articulate the African being as indigenous to land and soil, and that's offering a basis for claiming authentic African indigeneity. Such claim of indigenous indigeneity is contextual and is defined and must be understood by those who share that identity, as others like Beaver and Contasaso speak about. Such identity is expressed through historical, cultural, and spiritual memories, and as knowledge of ancestral land as power, a sense of place, being, living, ethics, action, about relationships with peoples, with animals, with water, seas, trees, as Leonard Simpson and others talk about when Kuchak also writes. Elders value their roles and responsibilities to teach about relations of past, present, future, in a spiral back and forth, not in a linearity. Very important for that. So what are some of the broader philosophical highlights I can point out? Let me start with this, the philosophical assumptions which are articulated in African elder social thought. One is the idea of the cosmology, the universe, as interdependent, interrelated, interconnected, and they offer cosmogonies. Also, the nature of being, that ontology, the ontological being, and that reality is, quote, fundamentally spirit and it's spiritual, but it has material manifestations, unquote, as Carol talks about. And then there's a particular value system which prioritizes interpersonal and reciprocal relationships, collective and community building and gain. And then the other aspect of that is that interface or the nexus of the body, mind, soul, and spirit, what I have called the Swahunu, which is a trialectic space, which is that can usage translated as the power of coming to know and to act responsibly. The second, in terms of bringing the broader theoretical themes to this discussion, is that elders' cultural knowledge are also very important in how we articulate the question of indigeneity, because they point to cartographies of indigeneity and indigenous. And the point here is what, to me, is what can be learned pedagogically from these indigenities on different lands and geospaces. African elders' cultural knowledge instruct us on how indigeneity, decolonization, and decoloniality are linked. Claiming elders' knowledge and these teachings allow us to write back to the imperial and colonial narrative to uphold the teachings of land, life, and place. It also allows us to read decolonial as a path or a process to an anti-colonial end, or to pursue an anti-colonial praxis in order to achieve a decolonial end. And then the third level of theoretical analysis is elders and contemporary challenges. And this is where elder appreciation, elder vulnerability. Elders are very appreciative of being heard. They also reveal concerns about current directions of society. Directions where we see the rugged individualism, the competitiveness, the disregard for culture, the disregard for history and local language. Also the youth disrespect and the devaluation of elders' knowledge, experience, and teachings. But this is also coupled with a contemporary systemic and institutional lack of attention to elders' welfare and well-being. And this is what the question about the elder vulnerability, that they are so important, and yet we seem not to give good care for their well-being. Then thirdly, is working with elders and elders' knowledge in schools. What does it mean to bring elders into classrooms? Is the goal simply to work with their knowledge? Now, if it's to work with their knowledge, it also raises the question, can indigenous knowledge be authentically taken up in classrooms in the absence of having elders in our schools. And I want to spend a few minutes now talking about this last point, because I think to me, in terms of the project of bringing elders into these spaces, we have to think through the feasibility and then the possibilities and the challenges. One is about the culture of schooling. When you look at the culture, the climate, the environment, the socio-organizational life of schools, what I have called the deep curriculum, right? They're all very, very power saturated. There's also the political economy of these institutions. The neoliberal marketization of education, where knowledge is being set, bought, and sold. If we bring elders, how are we going to value elders' labor of love? Because elders' knowledge is labor of love. Then also the Western liberal humanism, in terms of the racialization of the Black human, the extent to which schools, when we have, say, African elders and Black elders, how are they going to be seen in a climate of anti-Black violence, anti-Black racism? Also the tendency to consume, simply to consume other stories and not engage in actual subversion that is called for. So exposing others to the colonial racist academic space is something we should be concerned with. Then the question of academic coloniality. As Quijano long ago talked about, this coloniality is the violence of modernity. And it is not simply territorial, it is the academic physical space itself, as well as how the academics cultivate a way of thinking, a way of doing and acting and desiring. What is valued, the merit badges, the power politics, a privileging of a thinking in hierarchies rather than thinking in circles. Elders think in circles. The relationship of colonial violence on different bodies and the consolidation of white power. The whole problem of the hierarchical linearity of the academy. We talk about decolonization as beginning with asking new questions. But what informs these new questions? These new questions will have to be informed not by Western science scholarship. They have to be informed by non-Western indigenous epistemes, epistemologies, and philosophies. Then also the problem of the coloniality of science, the knowledge practice, the relationships, what constitutes valid knowledge, how such knowledge should be produced, interrogated, validated, and disseminated. And in particular, we look at the particularities of certain knowledges and their tendencies to masquerade as universal. So Orituba Oju talks about Western dominant frames of analysis and the imposition of colonial systems of knowing. The prevailing rules of reason, standards of logic, rationality. Dominant logics, white authority, control, and credibility. What this point out is that there are some missing dialogues in the academic spaces. But if you're going to bring these dialogues in the academic spaces, they have to respond to some of this culture of the academy. This is why there's a need to reframe our understandings of others' cultural knowledge. And one way we do that is to think that the particular place of indigenous epistemologies is to challenge, to threaten, to replace, and reimagine counter-narratives to colonial thinking and conventional practices of schooling education. So a sort of critical restoring of Black African indigenous lives through elders' knowledge. And also to ask the question, what possibilities of anti-colonial liberatory practice can emerge from working with elders' cultural knowledge, as people like Hansen and Attentive talked about? So how we use elders' knowledge to respond to the colonization of African indigenous knowledge. To me, using African elders' knowledge allows me to address the colonial appellation of African indigeneity. Working with African elders' understanding of what education is for, on the basis of that intergenerational knowledge and acquired wisdom. I think it's very, very important that We think about developing this indigenous worldview, which is very, very holistic, but it's also complementary in terms of the social, the physical, the spiritual, and metaphysical realms of existence. And working with the land and earthly teachings, what it means to live on the land, the knowledge that elders have relating to health and wellness, questions about family and household responsibilities, and the place of their experiential knowledge in teaching learners of today. We can't talk about elders without talking about local language, because elders communicate using local languages. And they are living libraries. And what, to me, we should think about is, and Grace Gallo and I have been having conversations around this, right? Getting to this idea of omnicentric knowledge, which is holistic, is attuned to the relational spheres with more than humans. And Roti and Hanika talks about inter-knowing, I would say intra-knowing, which is valued through indigeneity and making relational connections with other knowings, while also challenging anthropocentric ideologies and the prevailing colonial architectures of Western science knowledge. Now we're working with elders knowings to promote a form of non-dualistic epistemic, ontological, and multi-relational thinking, which is reflective of Arturo Escobar's famous words, multiple worlds within multiple worlds, when he speaks on the pluribus and the relational cosmovisions. We want a world in which many worlds fit. And Carmen and I talk about the possibility of another possible. We want a world in which many worlds fit to the possibility of another possible. So to conclude, to reiterate a couple of things, I think to me, what the work on eldership is getting to is the power of the cartographies of indigenous. But that power will rest on the pedagogic relevance of what a long time ago I talked about in terms of multicentric knowledges. And the indigenous scholar Kadeti also talks about multi-epistemes. To me, the question is what we can learn from these multiple knowledges. Secondly, using elders' teachings to humanize, to make human, to humanize schooling, and to heal all learners. Develop strategies of dismantling colonial hierarchies and the ongoing violence of modernity. So let's talk about. So for example, to work with what can be called a radical geography of schooling, land as life, earthly teachings of relationality, redistribution, sharing, reciprocity, connections, complementarity, mutual interdependence, building communities, ethics, and relationships. Ideas that people have been working with, even in Turtle Island context. We have Dana Simpson, Eve Tag and Young, Sandra Stiles, Duff, and Helms. This radical geography of schooling in terms of land as life, and the ontologies, the land literacies. Understanding elders' cultural knowledge also as epistemologies of decolonization and anti-coloniality. So here I'm looking at how stories shared by African elders become metaphors of resistance with an implicit knowing that decolonization and anti-coloniality cannot happen simply through Western science scholarship, because that's part of the problem, and it's a bigger part of the problem. And to see elders as offering us a grammar of Black educational futurity. And this grammar is a grammar that speaks to a striving and living for the present now, living for the future now, and guided by the lessons of the past as we search for these new futurities. That elders allow us to see decolonization as neither a hierarchical nor a linear process, Elders' knowledge reflects, quote, a continuous feedback from the past to the present to the future, offering a principle of hope or anticipatory consciousness that both discerns and realizes decolonization at the same time, unquote. And this is from Silvera Susicanquen, the Bolivian feminist anti-colonial scholar. Lastly, the power of repositioning African elders as educators in schools demands a critical and a deeper reflection on the academy itself. It calls for disrupting white supremacy and the logics of whiteness. It calls for advancing possibilities of effective anti-colonial strategies that create new educational spaces outside conventional school systems. As others also talked about, the power of creating these spaces which is outside the current educational spaces. So I'm just going to stop here. And thanks everyone. Asante Sana.
Thank you so much, Nana, for this wonderful presentation. I see we already have a few questions coming through, but I guess I just want to ask you if you want to have a short pause for water or anything, or how you're doing.
No, I think we can go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead. Okay, awesome. Thank you to many of you who have sent your questions into the chat. So I see one here. In the interviews conducted with higher education professionals, in particular, like those interviewed in South Africa, the person is wondering the following: did they offer any ideas on how they envisioned eldership could play a role in Western-rooted universities on the African continent?
Oh, Western what?
Western-rooted.
Mm-hmm. I think their sense is that there's something that's lost and they want it to be reclaimed, right? So they want to talk. This is what I talked about. What does it mean to talk about Africanity, right? So to me, there's something that has been lost, and I think that we see it in terms of the encroachment, right, of Western knowledge systems, right, on indigenous knowledges and the impact that it's having, right? The questions of also even the impact that it's having on African cultures, right? Rather than actually looking at a deep rootedness in African cultural values, we see the shifts into today's society where communities are having to deal with the encroachment of Western modernity on their cultural spaces. And that is creating some problems. And I think when we talk about the elder vulnerability, it speaks to that. The fact that, yes, elders are being disregarded, their knowledge are not being acknowledged and accepted, and sometimes they're disrespected. Actually, in South Africa, and I've shared this story with some of the students in one of my classes. You know, a teacher in South Africa asked, and they told me in one of the interviews, the teachers told the students, tomorrow when you are coming to school, bring me something of the past, right? To show me something of the past to show me. And guess what? One student brought their grandma. So they brought their grandma that's something of the past to show. And this was the teacher saying that, right? And this is the issue, right? So how do we deal with this? And I think this is the question about how we deal with this encroachment and the impact it's having on culture, it's having on the question of respect for history, heritage, and also what it means actually to talk about community, responsibility, ethics. Right? Before we go, I just want to give a shout. One of our Queen Mothers is in the room. I'm just looking at, I'm not sure why she's in the room, so I just want to give a shout to her. It's one of the Ghanaian Queen Mothers, who is actually a professor in the US. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Nana. There's another question. Are there still opportunities for elders in the community to be involved and contribute their knowledge to this towards this work or work with educators?
Yeah, I think this is something that I've been exploring, and I think one thing I want to do is to work this with some of the particularly in the Canadian context, some of the educators I mentioned. So people like Fiona Henry, Mary Green, Caris Newton, Donna Haraway, and so forth, right? How we work with some of the school boards, right? Particularly for our learners, African learners, right? To grant them. I think, as I said, there's a pitfall in doing that, right? There's a pitfall in doing that. We also have to look at the potentials and the possibilities in that. So to me, one of the goals of this research is to see how we can bring elders into these spaces, be mindful of the dangers, the coloniality of the academy, and bringing them into this space, right? And the linear hierarchicality that I talked about, right? The fact that within these spaces, there's a thinking in hierarchies rather than thinking in circles. There's even a question about, okay, how are we going to compensate them for this work? We don't, yes, their work is about labor of love, right? But are we bringing them into a space to face anti-Black racism, anti-Black hate, and get all this, right? As one of the elders said, we have retired. Why do you think we want to go back and get more of this hate and this violence, right? So this is things that we have to think through. And that's the power of working with community educators and how we do it.
Yeah, thanks, Nana. I guess kind of on a similar note, thinking about maybe challenges, did you find any challenge in this research regarding the definition of age and elderness?
Yeah. I think you see, generally there's this idea that somehow when we talk about elders, we talk of age. I think age is very important, right? But to many of the people we spoke to, right, it's more than just the age. It's what one has done with their life, right? So in other words, there has to be a manifestation of that age, right? Yes, age comes with wisdom, they know it, right? But that's why they make the distinction between elderly, right, and an elder, right? Somebody can be elderly, but not necessarily an elder. To be an elder, you have to have that it's a venerated status, right? It's a venerated status.
Yeah, thank you, Nana. There's another question and sort of comment, so contextualizing. So often our elders are some of the generations who have faced some of the strongest assimilation and material coercion to take on white logics, particularly on issues of gender and gender roles, sexuality and spirituality, religion. Given this, how do we center elder knowledge that may come along with some of the most harmful lessons from colonial powers, especially now as young generations push directly against those gender roles, heteronormativity, and so on, Christianity. And so on.
Yeah, I think to me that's why we have to teach about the basic ideas and the philosophical tenets of this elders' knowledge. Right? So when we talk about the elder knowledge as grounded in the authenticity of land, right? The knowledge of the land and its earthly teachings. How do we teach about what it means to talk about community of learners, to see schooling as community, right? To see that we are in a sort of that relational existence with each other. And this usurps the hierarchies, the coloniality, right? But also, look, there's a whole methodology of elders' knowledge. And this can be revealed when we look at storytelling, right? Storytelling, you go to an elder first for an advice. Don't think you're going to get the advice in a straightforward answer. So you go there for the talk, oh, give me this advice. And the elder says, okay, here it is, take it. No, he's going to sit you down. And you maybe have to spend about 30 minutes. It's going to be through a story, which is going to narrate all these experiences. And you are supposed to get something from, right? But it's also building a relationship. That knowledge is about building relationships. That we cannot just simply consume the knowledge without having a relationship with that knowledge.
Thank you, Nana. I think this touches on another question that came up, how African or other elder stories can be used in schools that are successfully done and respectfully done and not exploitatively.
Well, I think particularly, I mean, my own birthplace, Ghana, right? I mean, we have teachers who use Anansi stories. I'm sure in the Caribbean, right? We have teachers who use Anansi stories to teach powerfully, right? And I think when these Anansi stories, the learner is told about the analysis story and is asked to look at what are the teachings embedded in the story, right? So we do have examples of that, how we use it, right? And that, so and I think in these spaces we have the examples of how that is done. The challenge has always been that for example, we have to contend with Western colonial education, right? Which has its own apparatus, it has its own machine, it has its own structure, right? Which in many cases goes against indigenous schooling, and this creates tensions, right? In that. I mean, the idea of teaching where you have learners in a circle, right, is to show the connections among learners. It's to show the connection. So you're in a circle, like you join hands in a circle, you learning. If one leaves the circle, what happens to the circle? The circle is broken, right? And it needs to be healed back, right? And that. But so to me, I think we do have the examples of that. We do have examples that many teachers have been doing, right? But it's the tension with when it comes to modern educational system, right? I mean, we all have our horror stories to tell, right? I mean, growing up in Ghana, you face with an educational system where you know more about the waterfalls in somebody's country than your own village, right? And this is the education system that we're dealing with, right? But you see that we do have examples where schools are finding ways to ground people in local culture, local history, local heritage. It doesn't mean that there are not power issues that have to be dealt with, but I think at least these are locally centered approaches to education, right? That works with contextual based learning. So the context becomes very, very important.
Yes, thank you, Nana. There's a few questions sort of along the similar lines about knowing that colonial education is still widely taught in African school systems. How does eldership challenge and help unlearn Western ideologies and promote and create space for African knowledges?
Yeah, you see, this is what it's about reclaiming. This is about a project of reclamation, right? So we, like, yes, we look at Western educational systems, right? Colonial educational systems. And I think that we have that, right? Like I said, we don't have African universities. We have universities in Africa because they are colonial satellites of the Western academy. So we do have that problem, right? But I think this is why we have to look at some of the indigenous teachings that are connected to the questions of the land, that are connected to questions of responsibility. They are connected to questions about what is education for, right? Education is more than just going to get a job, right? Education is about building communities. Education is about an awareness, right? Education is about understanding one's identity and what identity is for, right? When an African elder says, it's not what you are called that is important, but what you respond to. They are not denying the question of the naming. The naming is very, very important, but the response to the name is most important to them. That is the question of the politics. What do you do with that naming? What do you do? What do you do? How do you respond to that call, right? And this is why, and I think to me, how we rethink education. So to answer the question, the challenge has been, and it always will be, right? What educational systems we want and are willing to fight for. That's been a challenge, right? That's been a challenge. Because we look at, say, the educational system, where you say African educational systems, where there's the race to internationalization, right? Sometimes World Bank and IMF have policies, and they come to Africa to try these policies on before they implement the policies anywhere else in that. And there has to be a resistance. And one way to talk about resistance is to talk about African indigenous cultural ways of knowing, African educational systems, and what they can teach the learner today. Right? And part of the problem sometimes is that sometimes we become our own worst enemies. Right? As I've said in some of my writings, sometimes some of the greatest pushback I have when I speak on African indigeneity, it's not from anybody, but from African scholars. they have been so schooled in Western Eurocentric discourse, right, that they read the world through that frame, right? So they ask you what's the theory here, and you ask them, what theory are you talking about? They are using Westocentric lens to evaluate what you're saying. In many cases, when you see that they are thinking through a linearity, it's a very, very hierarchical linear thinking that they are adopting. So to go back to what Severus Kankin is saying, it is that it's a spiral. The past, the present, and the future are fused. It's not a linear, it's the back and forth.
Yes, thank you, Nana. And considering what you've said based on that response about having those challenges and having pushback, there's another question about how do you address these pushbacks, like when you face pressure from others in these spaces?
I think, to me, you factor that in your work, right? That is always going to be resistance, right? But you have to be very, very authentic. To me, when I talk about being authentic, I don't mean purity. I don't mean a sense of uncontaminated. I'm talking about being true to oneself, right? Being true to oneself. I think we need to maintain our sense of authenticity. And that requires, for example, that, as Inyamno talks about, that we don't become intellectual imposters, right? In these academic spaces. Be true to yourself. Don't be an imposter. Be true to yourself. Don't mimic theories that hardly make any relevance to you, that make any sense to you. Because there's an expectation, but you push back, right? You push back because the academy has a way to validate and legitimize particular ways of thinking, particular ways of theorizing. Yes, show that you understand it, but push back with counter ways, right? That's what when I talk about Black theorizing. Black theorizing emerges from Black radical thought, right? And is grounded. Let our theories, let our epistemologies speak to our lived realities. So the pushback is always going to be there, right? And the pushback, right, it's not just for the sake of that, where people want to defend. They want to defend the system and the structure as it is. This is why when we talk about these issues, people have this sense of, well, is this knowledge? You ask, is this knowledge? And you ask them, how do you define the knowledge? And they're using particular tropes in their definition of what constitutes knowledge. You also see the pushback in terms of being sometimes seen as anti-intellectual by virtue of what you speak about, by virtue of what you stand for, by virtue of being a distinctive voice. But one of the things that I've said, particularly when I speak to with Black racialized Indigenous scholars, right, that I think we have to be on this project to pioneer analytical systems for understanding our own communities that are grounded in our own homegrown cultural perspectives, as Yanka talks about. Right? Very, very important. How do we pioneer new analytical systems that are grounded in our own homegrown cultural perspectives? That's a very important challenge. Okay. For too long, I mean, sometimes what happens is that we put our own communities under the bus. Right? In the name of trying to get ahead, we put our communities under the bus. Right? And that's why sometimes our communities, when we come into some of these spaces, some of these academic spaces, they are always seen as suspect. What did we do to get in here? What did we do to get into these spaces? And this is why our work has to be relevant. Relevant. And when I talk about relevance, I talk about community relevance. And I don't think that there's only one model of community relevance, but whatever it is, our work should be community, should have community relevance. It cannot just be for the sake of knowledge production. That's luxury. Luxury that some of us can't afford, right?
Yeah, Nana, thank you. And I think that touches as well a little bit on the question of the importance of bringing African elders to Canadian universities, and how it may benefit the young generation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think this is, look, we talk about Africa. Africa is here. We have to theorize Africa beyond its physical boundaries. Africa is not there. Africa is here. Africa is in our classrooms, right? Africa is in our classrooms. When I talk about Africa, Africa is in our classrooms where we are here, right? And that's why we have to theorize Africa beyond its physical boundaries. And I think it's very, very important, because I think when we have a school system where our learners are having to deal with issues of dehumanization, they're having to do issues of anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, they're having to do issues of coloniality, right? And impositions, right? We have to strengthen them spiritually, morally. And part of that strengthening them spiritually, morally, is to also let them be aware that they are grounded and rooted in history and culture. They're rooted in knowledge. They're rooted on the ground. They're rooted in indigenous ontologies, right? And be able to teach. And earlier on the question about stories, right? Teaching an answer story. There's more for learners to learn. It's more for Canadian learners to learn in teaching, in listening to answer stories. Proverbs. Right? We can work with African proverbs, just as we work with indigenous proverbs. We can work with African proverbs. When an African proverb says, rain does not fall on one roof, right? That's a powerful teaching. Rain does not fall on one roof. It's about that sense of building communities, to create communities of learners. Create communities of learners, right? Because our school system cultivates the sense of individualism. And I've spoken about this, but where, for example, we are in that competitive mode. I want to be seen as the only bright star in the classroom, the only student with the A's. So I have my idea, I don't want to share it because somebody is going to steal it. The world is only about me, 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 me. We don't talk about collective. We don't talk about responsibilities. We hear this neoliberal humanistic thought about individual rights. Yes, even in Africa, there's the individual. But the individual only makes sense in relation to the community that they are part of. So we have to distinguish between the competitive individual and the cooperative individual. And this is why we have to talk about the sense of what connects us. So to create communities of learners, to see schooling as community. Right? It's about shared responsibilities. It's about interrelationships. It's about mutual interdependence. So that if I'm having a challenge in the system, I'm having a problem on the school text, it's not just only my problem, it's our problem. But we've been told that, yeah, this is their problem, it's not our problem. And we need to move away from that.
Thank you, Nana. And I guess this is sort of taking that comment and thinking about practical ways to think about this. What are some tips that you have to take this understanding of the value of elders' knowledge to various sectors, to advocate for rethinking and reimagining the current policies and processes?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. No, that's that's a challenge for the next phase of the project, right? That's why I want to work with some of the educators within our communities, right? People who are actually on the ground in the schools, right? And to work with them, because being grounded in the schools, and that's why earlier on I mentioned questions about working with folks, community educators, right? The Donna, the Caris Newton, the Fiona, Kirkmark, those people who are actually grounded in schools and working with them. And that to me, I don't have a specific answer to that, except that this is something we are thinking through. How do we work with the body of knowledge that we generate to ensure that it translates on the ground in schools, in the school system. And that will require piloting some of our ideas with particular school board before we think about it. So it's a beginning journey, right? But that's the end goal of that, right? And you know, one of the things that to me on this point, right, that like we look at, yes, we look at Turtle Island elders, right? I engage in schools, right? Engage in schools, and there's more to be done, right? But they are way ahead, right? The African elders, right? We don't have African elders engaged in our school system, and we want to do that, to engage African elders in the school system, learning from Turtle Island elders and the engagement in the school system. But also, as I said, to me, the whole thing about the Cartographies of Indigeneity is about the lessons that we can learn from the geospaces, from the multiple sites, right? What does it mean, right, to learn from African indigeneity when working with Turtle Island indigeneity and vice versa? Right? Those things need to be done in construct.
Yes, Nana, thank you so much. And there's a question as well about the person agreeing with disrupting colonial notions about who has knowledge and whose knowledge is valued, but would like you to maybe expand a little bit on any dangers of essentializing.
Oh, yeah. Well, you see, let me put it this way. I understand the dangers of essentializing because Africa is not homogeneous. Just as when we talk about blackness, there's multidimensionality of blackness. Blackness is race, gender, is sexualized. We have to look at the queerness of blackness, for example, sexuality and those things, right? We understand all that, right? But sometimes too, we have to look at it in terms of there's a particular politics at play here, right? Whereby when we talk about, say, an African experience, we get a pushback that says we are homogenizing an African experience. No, what we are saying is that a Kenyan experience, a Nigerian experience, a Zimbabwean experience, a Ghanaian experience, at the end of the day, it's an African experience, right? It's an African experience. That's what we're talking about. So yes, the Ghanaian experience, the African experience is demarcated by the Ghanaian, the Nigerian, the Kenyan, right? And that. But at the end of the day, it's an African experience. And we should be allowed to speak about that, right? Without being seen as essentializing. And it also strikes me that the very people who essentialize all the time, when it suits them, only turn around when we use it to resist, right? Dominant groups essentialize all the time when it suits their interests. When the police officer stops a black man, they are not stopping the man because it's Nigerian, not or because he's Jamaican or because he's from Trinidad. It's because he's a black man. That's essentializing. So when people say, look, we need to also resist that brutality because of our identity, then we are told we are essentialized, right? So yes, there's the heterogeneities, and we know that. Edward Said a long time ago said, no one is one thing. I've said, no one has ever been one thing. But we are very, very strategic when we invoke certain things for particular politics, and yet mindful of the heterogeneities. We need to be mindful of the heterogeneities, right? Because sometimes what happens is, let me bring this to another level, right? Whiteness. You hear people when you talk about whiteness, whiteness is demarcated. Of course, whiteness is demarcated by gender, class, sexuality. We know that. We all know that. But at the end of the day, whiteness is whiteness. Irrespective of the class, the gender, sexuality, it is whiteness. It's a fragmentary passport of privilege, as Johar Dupree talks about. It's a passport that opens doors. We should be able to talk about that and not get a pushback that says we are homogenizing.
Thank you, Nana. And do you think, kind of related to that, that like critically thinking about things in this way is sort of an important way to, I guess, push back against those pushbacks? Or
Yes, yeah. No, I think, to me, I always remember when I've said this, when I first came to Origin, right? I remember asking students at the time to give me a title of papers for titles of papers that they want to present at the conference. And I mean, at the time, Handel Wright, who is now teaching at UBC, right? An African, very powerful African scholar, who's teaching at UBC, right? Gave me a title at the time. He says, quote, "Nothing personal, Shakespeare, semicolon. I would rather be reading Willie Soyinka." Right? Now, if you ask me who is Willie Soyinka, that's the problem Handel is speaking to. So we know about Shakespeare, we don't know about Willie Soyinka. So yes, to me, yes, sometimes we've had too much of Shakespeare. We need to be learning and unlearning. And part of that unlearning is taking away some of the heavy doses of Eurocentricity, moving it away and beginning to affirm ourselves in those marginalized knowledges, right? And I think, to me, this is so important to be able to do that, to be able to do that, because it affirms our intellectual thought and the power of that intellectual thought. It affirms a groundedness, this rich Black intellectual tradition that we can tap into. So I'll tell my students, yes, familiarize yourself with some of the dominant theories. It doesn't mean you should operate with them. And know what those dominant theories are, so that when it comes into a conversation, you can use your knowledge of counter theory to subvert the dominant theory. Because one of the things you don't want to do is when you try to critique something you know nothing about. Because there's too much of that, right? Afrocentricity. A lot of people seem to know everything about Afrocentricity, but when you get to them, when you ask them really, what are you talking about? They are working with one or two knowledges. Like a little learning can be dangerous. They have that little learning about Afrocentricity and they run away with it like they know everything about Afrocentricity, so they condemn it. So what I'm saying is that ground yourself in that so that you can participate in the conversation. And then you can use your episteme to interrogate it, because then people know where you're coming from. What I don't want people to do is where, for example, we talk about these things, right? You'll be critiquing something using the dominant lens to interrogate a counter episteme. So you ask me, Nana, could you tell me a bit about the theory behind Afrocentricity? And I try my best to say, well, this is what I think it is, right? And then somebody will respond, oh, but no. To me, it's not theory. Only to find out that this person is using a dominant frame to interrogate the way I'm speaking about Afrocentricity. That's a no-no. Don't use dominant frames to interrogate counter epistemes. Otherwise, it's like we're using the same yardstick to measure the worth of a counter episteme. And there's a problem with that. There's a problem with that. I think it's very, very important when I talk about being grounded, that groundedness, the power of groundedness, right? That power of groundedness is groundedness on the land, is groundedness on particular ontology that emerges from that groundedness. But you don't stay there. It only becomes a starting point of your interrogation.
Thank you, Nana. I think that's a lot to reflect on. There've been a lot of questions. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful participation. I am mindful of the time. I think we've gone over a little bit. Nana, are you all right?
Oh,
Or maybe would you be okay for one more question or so? Yeah.
If there's any last question, that's okay. You can take it.
Yeah. So there was. Oh, actually, there are two. One quick one about the name, who you mentioned when it wasn't, no offense, Shakespeare.
Oh, yes, Handel Wright. Handel, Handel, and then Wright, Wright, Handel Wright, Handel Kashupi Wright. He's teaching at UBC. He's a very brilliant scholar. I like his work.
Oh, okay. And I think it was the other name as well, William Sharinka?
Oh, Wally Shoyinka.
Willie Sharinka. Okay.
Yeah, well, yeah. No, and the point I was saying is, you see, so we know about Shakespeare, but we don't know about Amata Edu. We don't know about Chinua Achebe. We don't know about Wally Shoyinka and Chimanda Adichie. I mean, see, that becomes a problem, right? That becomes a problem, right? We do have, within our own community, we do have our own literary scholars. But I don't want to say that we don't want to learn about other literary scholars. No, we should, but I want us to be grounded in our literary scholars because they also have something to say. They have something to say. We cannot longer continue to be party of the devaluation of these scholars, and the silence in their works. I think to me, I was saying to my crowd the other day, example, it's about, there's a question of how we find our center. To me, any scholar, you have to find your center. Finding your center, to me, the way I define it is like finding my voice and be a distinctive voice, a distinctive Black voice, right? And I'm proud to be called a Black scholar. I'm not going to get into argument with you. Oh no, I'm a scholar, not a Black scholar. No, I'm a Black scholar. I want to be known as a Black scholar. I'm proud of that, right? Because there's something with that, being named a Black scholar. A Black scholar is about resistance, right? It's about resistance. So to me, fine. But I think also that, I mean, for every scholar has to also think about what Fanon said, is that every generation, out of its relative obscurity, must come out and define for itself its mission, and either fulfill it or betray it. We have to discover our mission, and we fulfill or betray it. And that's why it's so important, right, that when we come into these spaces, we never forget how we got here. Coming onto this land, what brought us onto this land? We should not forget that. It calls for a conscientization, but it calls for an action. It's not enough to be conscientized. You have to engage action. Right? But it's very important to deal with that, right? When we come into this space, when we come into academies, not to forget the history that brought us into these spaces. A lot of blood, a lot of struggle, fight had to be undertaken to get us here. In Zimbabwe, they talk about every classroom is a war front that people had to fight to liberate. That's why our scholarship has been about, it must be about salvation. It must be about salvation.
Thank you, Nana. I think you've touched a little bit upon most of the questions, so I really want to thank you for doing that and for being here and for everyone for participating. And
I also want to thank, I mean, I've seen so many familiar faces in the room. I just going around now, I'm seeing so many, and I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Friends, people I've been seeing for quite a bit of time now.
Yeah, this event has been recorded and still being recorded. So it'll be posted on the YouTube page, CIER OIZ. I'll send out a link to those who attended or registered so that everyone can access it later and come back to all these incredible points that you've been making, Nana.
And I'm gonna take care. I'll see you now.
Thank you very much, Nana, for such an invigorating discussion. Thank you. Always,
Thank you.
always a pleasure.
Thanks.
So if anyone wants to stay back, I will be here and I'll keep it open, Nana, depending on your time, just for final comments or anything. But this concludes the formal presentation and question and answer session. So thank you again, everyone. And I hope to see you again soon for future CIER events. And thank you, Nana.
You're welcome.